In this video, I want to discuss a few questions about mind, where it came from, what it's doing currently, what its purpose is, and I want to discuss all of this in reference to the coronavirus because it's such an excellent example of how the mind responds to the unknown. And I want to start off with a quote by Graham Hancock, and he put it very beautifully where he said, "We are a species suffering from amnesia." And he meant this in a slightly different context. The way I like to use this quote is that we all are possessed in some degree by the mind, and we are clueless as to where it came from, what it's doing here, and what its purpose is. So just a reminder from my other videos, this program that we have running in our skull is at least 40,000 years old. It could be much older. It's built for survival, and it came online at a time when the environment is virtually unimaginable compared to what it is today in terms of dangers, and so it had to be paranoid. But I want to specifically talk about the difficulty the mind has with numbers, and so Dunbar, the anthropologist who came up with what now is known as Dunbar's number, theorized that based on brain capacity, we have the cognitive ability to deal with about 150 people that we might call friends. And so you may have 5,000 Facebook friends, but in reality, you only have the mind has the cognitive capacity to deal with about 100 or 150 people. And in some cases, it's much worse. And so Alan Watts talked about a culture whose mind went from one, two, three to many. So everything between four and infinity all got lumped together as one thing. And so we've got this mind that's extremely limited in terms of the numbers. But every day we're confronted with the media and science, and they expose us to these numbers that are been crunched based on thousands of data points, sometimes tens of thousands, sometimes more. And the mind has absolutely no way to deal with that. In fact, I'm working on a new book, and I even titled the chapter, Why the Mind Sucks at Statistics. And if you ever dealt with this, you probably can relate that these large numbers and probability, they're all products of the mind. And at the same time, uh, the way it evolved, it simply can't deal with these kind of large numbers. And so what it does is it just either shuts down or it just responds with kind of an extreme level of fear. And that's where a lot of people were over the last month or so. They're trying to deal with these hypothetical scenarios, and the mind just kind of freaks out because it's just trying to estimate the probability of something, and it really can't do the number crunching the way a computer does, because the mind is maybe a computer program, but it runs much differently than a computer that you're using. So what's the next step? So at first we just sort of freak out about it and we sort of shut down. Well, the next step, once it becomes pretty much widespread, is a certain level of acceptance, but also denial, which is exactly what we've done with every other virus. And it's the same thing we do with anything else that can kill us and hurt us and harm us and take us offline. And every day you go through from driving to work to flying in a plane. But the mind has eventually learned to adapt by simply not thinking about these things. With some people, not everyone, but for the majority, that's sort of the mind at its best case scenario. And keep in mind that while the mind was evolving, there were really two kinds of minds that evolved. The majority of us, like someone like me who bumps into someone and then thinks they have a disease, which is based on paranoia and being very cautious. And that's probably, I'm not sure what the numbers are, but that's probably the majority of minds out there. But at the same time, we also needed a number of adventurous minds that really had this capacity to ignore risk and the numbers. Like Kirk would always be like, you know, or Spock would tell Kirk that the odds are 1 in 10,000, and Kirk didn't care. He's like, I don't care. I'm just going to do it anyway. I don't care if it's 1 in a million, and he still succeeded. So we needed a number of kind of Kirks in the world too to kind of explore and adventure out. And these are the people out there, flying around in these squirrel suits, jumping out of planes. They're probably not at all worried about some virus or anything else. So I'm only talking about that first kind of mind. And if you're watching this, that's probably something you can relate to because you're not out flying in your squirrel suit. So what do we do about all this? Well, There's a story by Krishnamurti. It's one of my favorite stories when he told his secret to his students. And he kind of whispered this, like, "You want to know my secret?" Everyone gathered around, and he simply said, "I don't mind what happens." And when you think of this, it's really kind of the short version of so much of my work and so much of the stuff going on out there these days, to not mind what happens and think about mind in this case as a verb, to catastrophize, to come up with the worst case scenario, to be survivalistic, to be selfish, to just worry, okay, because that's really, what are we worried about? We're worried about ourselves. We're worried about this part of the program that, and this is another one of my videos where I talk about this, where if a program is going to survive, and that's its instinct, and it works in this kind of egotistical self-image, well, that's going to really help its overall survival. And that's what the self is. It's just this idea that really helps the program make it on to the next generation. The problem is the self has so much baggage. And the cognitive scientist Joseph Ledoux has a one-liner that puts it really well. He said, "No self, no fear." And so this fear response that we feel, when we think the self is threatened, it only happens. It only happens because the self is threatened. You put away the self, you turn down the self, you turn down the mind, which turns down the self, and then it's far less likely to have this response of fear. And so that's the thing. Take some time. And it's almost kind of a trendy thing I've noticed, where people are finally picking up on the importance of not thinking, which is just another way of saying turn the mind down a little bit every day. And if you can have a couple moments of not thinking, this is these blissful moments where we realize that regardless of statistics, regardless of these stories and scenarios that are out there, uh, everything's actually quite fine, quite perfect, even exactly how it is. So find a little time to not think. Remember that statistics are overwhelming. The mind cannot deal with these, and no self and no fear. Um, all these things work, and I'd appreciate your comments. Let me know what you think.